Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. So, think back to that massive blockbuster movie about the Titanic. We all remember it, right? The heartbreaking scenes, the dramatic sinking, those clear-cut villains. But I really want to challenge you right off the bat here. How much of what you saw on the silver screen actually matches the real historical and forensic realities of that tragic night back in 1912? Well, we're about to find out. And honestly, the answers might shock you.
Today, we're putting those deeply ingrained pop culture myths to the ultimate test. We're going to look at the most famous shipwreck in history through the lens of modern science, deep-sea wreck exploration, and actual historical records, all to separate the cinematic fiction from the cold, hard facts.
So, here's our roadmap for today. First, Hollywood versus history. Second, the invisible iceberg. Third, the third-class tragedy. Fourth, the real sinking angle. And finally, rewriting real lives.
Okay, let's dive into this with Section 1. Hollywood versus history, the mechanics of the collision.
You've definitely seen the cinematic portrayal of the iceberg just doing its deadly work against the side of the ship, violently tearing it wide open. For decades, the prevailing myth, what pretty much everyone believed, was that the iceberg acted kind of like a giant icy can opener. The story went that the ice sliced a continuous, catastrophic 300-foot gash straight down the side of the hull, just instantly dooming the supposedly unsinkable ship.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that modern sonar mapping and incredibly thorough deep-sea wreck explorations have completely flipped this narrative on its head. There was no continuous movie-style slice into the metal. No way. That giant open wound theory has actually been completely disproven.
Instead, the actual physics of the collision were totally different. The massive impact of the ship scraping against the ice caused the hull's steel plates to buckle inward under all that immense pressure, and this buckling popped the rivets holding the plates together, which ended up creating a series of thin, disjointed slits right across several watertight compartments. So it wasn't one big cut, right? It was this devastating failure of the structural seams.
Moving on to Section 2, the invisible iceberg, why they didn't see it coming.
If you remember that tense lookout scene in the movie, a lot of the blame for the disaster gets pinned squarely on one missing piece of equipment. The cinematic myth claims that the lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, spotted the iceberg way too late simply because they didn't have their binoculars. But in reality, binoculars wouldn't have helped at all in those specific conditions. Historical experts and sea captains actually testified that lookouts in 1912 preferred scanning the horizon with their naked eyes. Why? Because the naked eye gave them a much wider field of view to catch threats in the dark.
So you're probably wondering, why couldn't they see it with their naked eyes then? Well, this brings us to a really crucial meteorological phenomenon called a thermal inversion. On that very night, this condition created a visual haze that completely obscured the horizon. Modern scientific analysis shows that this thermal inversion essentially camouflaged the ice in the distance. The iceberg wasn't just dark, it was literally impossible to see until it was right on top of them.
Let's turn to Section 3, the third-class tragedy. The human element below deck.
When we look at the terrible fate of the steerage passengers, we find one of the most heartbreaking and frankly infuriating cinematic myths out there. The idea that they were forcibly locked behind physical gates and deliberately left to drown just so the wealthy travelers could escape safely. The reality is completely different. Yes, physical gates did exist to separate the classes, but they were primarily installed to comply with really strict U.S. immigration and quarantine laws of that era. Official historical inquiries found absolutely zero evidence that passengers were intentionally confined below decks to die.
So why was the death toll so incredibly high in third class if they weren't locked in? Sadly, the real tragedy was a matter of devastating logistics. First off, just the sheer distance. They were physically located the furthest away from the lifeboats. Second, the labyrinthine layout of the ship made navigating up through the decks incredibly confusing, especially when everyone is in a panic. And third, delayed instructions meant they simply didn't know the urgency of the situation. It was a compounding logistical nightmare, not some malicious plot.
Which brings us to Section 4, the real sinking angle, reassessing the final moments.
The final structural failure of the ship is always the visual climax of any retelling, right? Hollywood makes it incredibly dramatic, terrifying, towering, and it's perfectly represented by a 45-degree angle. In the movies, the ship lifts its stern incredibly high, nearly perpendicular to the water, hanging there ominously before violently splitting in half. It makes for absolutely incredible edge-of-your-seat cinema. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly where Hollywood takes massive liberties just for the sake of visual tension. The dramatic 45-degree break is a total myth. Actually, finding the wreck at the bottom of the ocean shattered this traumatic illusion forever.
When structural engineers and forensic scientists analyzed the remains, they discovered that the hull failed at a much lower, way more gradual angle before the ship broke in two.
The calculations by those structural engineers tell a totally different story, 11 to 23 degrees. The ship simply did not have the structural integrity to hold its massive weight up in the air at a steep 45 degrees. It broke in two while sitting much, much lower in the water, somewhere between an 11 and 23 degree angle. Now this makes the final break far less visually spectacular than the movies suggest, though obviously it was absolutely no less terrifying for the people living through it.
Finally, Section 5. Rewriting Real Lives. The villains of the story.
We all know that dramatic tension in a script usually requires a clear bad guy, but cinema has really unfairly tarnished the reputations of the real human beings who endured this historical trauma. Take White Star Line chairman J. Bruce Ismay, for example. The cinematic myth portrays him as this arrogant executive who relentlessly pressured Captain Smith to speed up through a known ice field just to set a record. But the historical reality? Ismay never pressured the captain to break any speed records. He survived the sinking only to face an incredibly unfair, widespread character assassination by the press at the time, which filmmakers later just adopted as absolute truth.
Even more tragic, honestly, is the cinematic treatment of First Officer William Murdoch. Pop culture depicted him as a panicked, corruptible murderer who took bribes and shot innocent passengers before taking his own life. The reality, that depiction was entirely fabricated to add drama to the movie's climax. Naturally, portraying a real historical figure this way caused a massive and completely understandable backlash from his living relatives.
To really understand the grave real-world consequences of historical inaccuracy, you have to look no further than the studio's response after the movie came out. Quote, "The studio eventually had to formally apologize to his family and donate to a memorial in his hometown. They actually had to make public amends because they sacrificed a real man's legacy, someone who literally died trying to save others, all just for a cheap plot point."
So that brings us to a final thought I want to leave you with today. As we look at how modern science, sonar scans, and historical records correct these deeply ingrained myths, we really have to ask ourselves, does cinematic drama ever justify rewriting historical truth? It's definitely something to critically think about the next time a huge Hollywood blockbuster claims to tell a true story. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and always keep questioning what you see on screen.